I love that Oda chose Eris as the name for the wife of such a controversial figure as Mr. Xebec, given that she shares a name with the Greek goddess of strife and discord, which feels very thematically relevant at the current moment. I agree, and it definitely fits Rox extremely well, for him to have married the personification of chaos. However, the reason why this name really made an impact on weekly fictional pirate analysts is because we have potentially seen it before, as the word Eris does appear to be part of Emu's spell circle, something that was noted a long time ago, long before we knew the name of Eris in this chapter, and some people were convinced that the writing on the circle actually spells out a name, that name being Eris D. Tar or something similar. I can see the Eris, I buy into the Eris. I'm not sure if I quite buy the D-Tar part, at least not yet. But this circle, it's got to have some meaning to Oda at the very least, because he's deliberately used a lot of the Latin alphabet to construct it, as well as some Japanese characters as well. So I'm sure that this isn't just random set dressing for the circle, but we have yet to see the circle again and confirm whether or not this is consistent scribbling, and Rox's wife having a similar name to something we saw here could still be a coincidence, or it could be a not that. And we could be about to see something very magically tragicsome unfold that cements Eris's name as part of Emu's abilities. Internal discord between Summers and Garling makes me feel like Summers hates Shamrock, which could prove interesting as far as infighting between them. I agree with the word interesting. It was interesting to see this, although I don't know if it's a discord or a personal dislike between Summers and Garling. To me, this feels a lot like the inevitability of building a society where everyone believes that they are literal gods with divine rights, because what happens when the divine will of one god runs counter to the divine will of a second god? You get a system where everyone believes that they and they alone have the paramount right to do whatever they want, like what happened with St. Summers here. He's aware that there's a hierarchy, but he doesn't care, because he believes that his right is superior and that he can decide to do whatever he wants. Again though, there is still a hierarchy, and Summers does need to be a little bit sneaky about this so as not to incur Garling's wrath, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was also some animosity between Shamrock and Summers, because we haven't seen the rest of the Holy Knights yet. But Summers reminds me of a lot of people that I used to work with in my earlier days. I used to encounter a lot of guys in their 60s who were working the same job as I was in my 20s and making the same money as I was again in my 20s. And Summers does feel like he's at that eternal career dead end, because after all this time, he's still a Holy Knight. And he's watched not just Garling rise into prominence above him, but also now Shamrock. And I do hope that we at some point get to examine more of the internal social politics within the World Nobles, because I cannot imagine that these of all people, are a perfectly united group. There has to be constant plotting and superiority complexes happening that could make for some very interesting stories should Oda elect to go down that path. Shout out to Shanks for being able to achieve Yonko status despite literally being dropped on his head as a baby. That is right. And I'm sure it came with no negative chronic alcoholism consequences whatsoever. But look, if a baby that's been dropped on its head can become an emperor, then you, watching this video right now, you have no excuse. Now go out there and make something of yourself after you've finished watching this video. And also take a nap first to re-energize yourself with the sponsor of this video, Manta Sleep, which have revolutionized my life with their wonderful masks, capable of blocking out any daylight or even any sound with the Manta Sleep mask, which is what I've got right here. I genuinely use this bad boy, I think every day. Pretty much, yeah, because I tend to work from about 8 a.m. to 9 p.m. And in that time, I like to sneak in a couple of little 15-minute naps. The Manta Sound also happens to be my favorite mask with immersive Bluetooth headphones, 20 hours of battery life, and that true 100% blackout experience I'm looking for. However, I will say that in the summer, I am also a big fan of the Manta Cool, because mate, it gets hot down under, and the Manta Sleep also have a wider range of other masks to suit your particular sleep requirements, of which you have many more than you may think, because sleep is one of the single most important factors in maintaining both your mental and physical health. Even the tiniest, just the tiniest bit of sleep deprivation can take an enormous toll. And you are not going to achieve complete and total world domination without good sleep. So you can and should check out Manta Sleep through my link in the description, as well as use my code for a 10% discount and revolutionize your sleep today. So definitely check them out. These things, they are brilliant. But for now, it's back to you, me. Thanks, me. Remember when we were looking forward to seeing what Devil Fruit Loki had? Me too. I still am looking forward to it. I've just resigned myself to the fact that it's probably going to be more of a 2026 revelation. Although actually that could be very wrong, because Loki will supposedly eat this legendary devil fruit in this here flashback. So we could see his abilities revealed here, although I feel like Oda usually saves this sort of stuff for bigger moments in the modern day story. However, Loki, we do know that he probably was not the first person to find it. It feels like so long ago now, but when this flashback first started, we caught a glimpse of a nefarious shadowman approaching the forbidden Elbathian fruit. And we still have no idea who that was, or for us at the God Valley point in time, who that will be, but a Holy Knight probably isn't a bad guess. And something else we haven't even come close to touching on because he's a baby at the moment is Shanks' relationship with King Harold. The whole reason why Shanks was on Elbaf on that fateful day was to talk to Harold about something that Shanks discovered during his time at Marijois. Innocent civilians being killed in broad daylight, and Garp is more focused on going after Roger. I can't wait to see his conversation with Dragon after all this. So I've been a pretty big Garp defender during this entire incident, because I don't believe that Oda means for him to come off as a bad guy, and either he or the Marines that he has inspired and cultivated are going to be a massive part of the Dawn of the World. And Luffy's even hoarding an adorable Garp plushie in the color spread with all of his most treasured people, his family, if you will. However, there is definitely something to reckon with in this chapter, which is that line Garp says about going fishing and finding himself some big ol' sea kings. What he's doing with the Roger and the Rocks pirates, or at the very least the language he's using, is similar to how the world nobles are describing their contest. You know, they're not out massacring natives, they're out hunting for rabbits, them wascally wabbits. And I don't know if that's a deliberate similarity that Oda's inserting, but it is quite concerning to see Garp being on a similar wavelength, albeit directed at a more just cause. And look, knowing what Big Mom and Kaido eventually become, it is hard to say that Garp's wrong for seeking them out here to prevent the suffering of millions in the future whilst he potentially has the opportunity to do so. But at the same time, I do need to see how this turns out for Garp, because he does have some questions to answer. Mr. Internet Man, have you noticed how Baby Shanks' left arm is often left out of frame? I think Oda does that on purpose to help us tell the difference, meaning the difference between Baby Shanks and Baby Shamrock. And I'm not sure how purposeful this is, but I do find it quite funny, especially the shot of Shanks on the ground in this chapter, because his left arm, look at it, it has indeed been cut off, not by a Lord of the Coast, but by paneling. And it's almost as if Ichiro Oda is saying to us, don't get used to this whole two-armed business. We'll be back to our regular Shanks programming quite shortly. Internet mate, it's weird that Maffy attacked Dragon and not Garling himself. I'm definitely anticipating them meeting at some point though. When do you think they'll meet? Maybe when Dragon puts Baby Shanks in the chest. So a couple of things here. It's not odd that Garling didn't show up in this chapter, because at this point, Garling doesn't even know that his kids have been napped. Maffy was acting on behalf of whoever was in charge of keeping the babies safe, but this leads to a fateful miscommunication where Maffy doesn't actually seem to realize that Garling has twins. So she believes that just securing Shamrock is completing the mission, meaning that both Maffy and whoever originally lost the babies are still going to be subject to Garling's wrath. Maybe less so Maffy, because at least she tried. But with Shamrock secured, for Garling and Dragon to meet at this stage, we would have to see Garling realize that one of his babies is still missing. And I would definitely love to see them interact, because Dragon and the Revolutionary Army are of course being built up as the endgame opponents of the Holy Knights, so some history between their leaders would always be good to see. But as for putting Shanks in the chest, there's probably going to come a point where Dragon realizes that he cannot get off this island with Shanks. Maybe Dragon comes to the conclusion that he's not leaving this island full stop. He's dead. And so he desperately shoves Baby Shanks into a chest and lets fate take the wheel. And given that Maffy has now seen his face, Dragon's notoriety is going to spread insanely quickly, and again Dragon might be put in a situation where he has resigned himself to death before being saved by another act of fate. But by the time Dragon reclaims his life, what's this? Some fiendish pirates have made off with all the treasure, which is where I, Dragon, left the baby for safekeeping. Mr. Internet Man, ? How is Oda so good at writing romance between Shaki and Ray Lee? I was under the impression he didn't enjoy writing that subject. So this might sound odd, but I actually think that Oda is so good because he doesn't like doing it. Due to not being a huge fan of implementing romance in his series, Oda doesn't dwell in all of the feels like a standard shoujo manga would. He instead surgically implements romance. He does it as efficiently as possible so that we don't have to spend, say, entire chapters seeing Shaki and Rayleigh constantly doing a will they, won't they, and walking away dramatically from the camera and crying and all that. Because there isn't a won't they, we know that they will. So there's no point doing the won't they. And trying to insert more of that artificial drama, that would just end up becoming romance porn. And another thing that Eiichiro Oda very effectively does is he inserts these romantic sections into deep plots of action, which adds a sort of urgency that forces characters to move on quickly and not get bogged down in the standard romance tropes, which isn't just true of this flashback, as if we look back on Sanji and Pudding, the race to bake Bigger Mama a cake and escape Whole Cake Island allowed Oda to drop in a lot of strategically placed romance at good places, and with a fantastically heartbreaking ending because it was the action-based circumstances that forced Sanji to leave. Whereas, and look, I'm not hugely experienced in this genre, but my impression of a more straightforward romance is a stagnant setting, something like a high school, where characters actually cannot get away from each other because they're legally mandated to be together 5 days a week. And in settings like that don't really move, it can feel quite artificial to need to conjure drama. But TLDR, I guess, Oda is good at writing romance because he knows how to administer the right dose to his particular audience. And for those who aren't at all interested, there's always action happening around it to satisfy them. Dear Internet Man, did you notice that Gil Basta only has one set of arms in this chapter? This is strange, because the man with 4 arms in chapter 1096 is very clearly him. Is this a mistake? I'm not sure if we can conclusively tell that from this chapter or in his appearance in chapter 1159. Gil Basta can be seen here, and it does look like he's a pretty standard dude, although Silver Axe is obscuring a lot of his body, so that could just be giving us a standard dude illusion. And as mentioned in chapter 1096, the man identified as Gil Basta does indeed have 4 arms, and his future zombie on Thriller Bark also has 4 arms. If we do see a panel of him that conclusively shows Gil Basta with 2 arms, then my guess would be that this is a devil fruit, and that after he died, Moria and Dr. Hogback decided to stitch extra arms onto his body, because that's just what he was known for. And if it is fruit related, then we already know at least one power that could make this happen, which would be Vice Admiral Onigumo's ability. But Gil Basta could also be some sort of naturally 4-armed man that we're just not getting a good glimpse of in these recent chapters. I think Saint Summers is the best villain in the series right now. I don't despise him one bit though, because we've been crying out for a good villain since Doflamingo. I mean, I might disagree on the since Doflamingo. I think we've gotten a ton of fantastic villains since him, but for this current arc, I think I agree. And it's because Saint Summers is currently the only antagonist that actually makes me feel something. It's a lot of bad things, but he's doing it. Whereas everyone else on Elbaf who fills that antagonistic role is quite stoic and very neutral. Ima, for example, a very cool villain, especially when using Gunko as a vessel, but I don't have a strong opinion on his personality because we have yet to really see any of it. And Figgle Shamrock, he had a lot of promise, but he's gone away now, far away, and while he was here, he didn't really demonstrate the depth of depravity that I'm looking for in a Holy Knight, and also what Summers happens to be living up to. Then we also have St. Killingham, who's more like comic relief, and as for Gunka herself, I'm still not convinced she's actually going to turn out to be a villain, which leaves us with Summers. And look, he may be kicking children out of trees to their spiky deaths, but at least he's proud of it. He's putting in the effort to be worth being despised, as is young Garling, to be fair, but I feel that Elbaf is desperately craving a charismatic main antagonist, which is leaving space for Summers to shine in all of the wrong ways, very much like how Kanjuro stepped in as a very compelling villain over both Orochi and Kaido during Wano, because to me there was always something much more sinister and more emotionally gripping about Kanjuro. Speaking of Kanjuro though, we have an important development on the cover page of this chapter, as within Kozuki Oden Shrine there are a number of honored names written on lanterns, including Oden Tokuyasu, as well as the 3 samurai that were stuck in a cave with Yamato, and Pedro. I'm so glad that Pedro got a lantern and is now lighting the world and contributing to the dawn that he so wanted to see. But very curiously, right next to Pedro's name is a name that is obscured by Yamato's horns. However, we can make out the first first kanji, and that kanji reads as Kuro. So the natural assumption would be that this lantern is honoring Kurozumi Kanjuro. And I think it's likely that Kanjuro was placed here because he was a well-known vassal of Odin, but him being a traitor, that wasn't widespread information. And in the end, it's probably better to let people think that Kanjuro was a hero to help somewhat redeem the Kurozumi name for the future of people like Kurozumi Tama. Because this whole ordeal on Wano started with the unjust persecution and murder of the Kurozumi clan, and if word got out that Kanjuro had also been a very naughty boy, then that Kurozumi prejudice is gonna start all over again. Plus, I kind of like the idea that even in death, Kanjuro is playing a role, like the actor he is. There's also a bunch of other lanterns that are too obscured to make out who they're honoring, but from the ones we can see, also present is Hyogoro's wife, Izo, and Ashura Doji. And I also wanted to mention the color spread of this chapter, which is one of the best I have seen in recent history. It's very tempting to print this one out and frame it on my wall, and there's so much going on here that I don't think I have the remaining lifespan required to point out each and everything, but I do want it noted that in addition to Bellmare, Nojiko, and Vivi, Nami is also carrying a Haridas plushie, showing just how much she cares for him after the time skip. In addition to that, Luffy's haul is very sweet. I love that he has Dadan and Makino included, but also Whitebeard, which I don't think is for him, but more because of how much Whitebeard meant to Ace, and how Whitebeard went on to become Ace's father. And if you look between Luffy's legs, as I know you watching this video on the internet always want to do, you will see a surprise whoop slap, which made me very happy. And around Luffy, you can also see Yamato, Kinemon, and Momonosuke, and they're all placed in quite special positions, which I believe reflects their status as honorary Straw Hats. And it's also worth mentioning that a Buggy plushie appears in this color spread, because I believe he's the only antagonist we see here. Every other character is someone precious to at least one of the other crew members, and we also happen to have Buggy also. And I think maybe that's because Buggy is precious to Shanks. This chapter killed that long old theory that Garp is Luffy's maternal grandfather, making Dragon his son-in-law, not son. In the panel, the Dragon looked at Garp from below and said, "Old man?" So what Dragon actually says here is Oyaji, which means father, but also gets used as a father figure. That's how all of the Whitebeard pirates refer to Whitebeard, for example. However, what really killed the Dragon's son-in-law theory was something actually noticed by very few people, and it was in chapter 1087, where Garp said that he can't believe his son became a revolutionary, which was the first time a Garp had actually referred to Dragon as his son. In every other case, Garp was quite vague, but we have had confirmation on this for quite a while. Although I don't blame anyone for either not knowing this or just forgetting this, because the information, it was stuffed into such a tiny panel, and it was overshadowed by Garp fighting against Kuzan in that same chapter. Love the random man-maya scrub getting cheap shots on the rabbits, while God Valley is literally on fire. Dude came to win. That was quite funny. Horrific in action, obviously, but funny because of the context of the Man-Maya family and their utter failure. As it becomes clear that the tournament has been interrupted, this Man-Maya Holy Knight cannot accept that, because this is the first time in ever that the Man-Maya family have a chance of doing well. So she just keeps on playing to rack up those points, and even starts shooting the pirates who have appeared on the island as a bonus. Man on the internet, I find it hard to grasp that this whole God Valley flashback would not have happened originally, since Oda never fully intended to do an Elbaf arc. So firstly, I do think that God Valley was intended, I'll go into that in a bit, but this goes to show you how good of a writer Oda is. Although, if you do think about it, then you can see how this happened. The God Valley story is pretty isolated from the Elbaf events, it's not really part of the Elbaf flashback, and every time that Harold pops in to see Rocks, it's almost like an anime inserting a filler character. As if you take all of the Harold scenes out, it doesn't really change anything for the story of Rocks and God Valley. At least not yet, that could go on to be very wrong as well. It depends on whether or not Harold wants to make an appearance on God Valley himself. At the moment, what we would lose is that emotional friendship between Rocks and Harold, but it doesn't make a huge functional difference to cut Harold scenes. So what I think is that the God Valley story we're seeing right now was always meant to be told. It's not like if Oda did decide to skip Elbaf, which he himself said he almost did, the God Valley would have never happened. I think it's more that Oda needed to find a way to make Elbaf a story worth telling, which is a very high standard at this point in One Piece, and he needed for Elbaf not to feel like a step down in terms of substance. So Oda's challenge was to tie it to some very deep parts of One Piece history, as well as some key aspects of One Piece future with Emu and Shamrock. And this is probably looking too far ahead for now, but if Oda had to move the God Valley flashback forward for this arc, then it makes me wonder how he's going to escalate again in the next arc, having now lost this plan.